let's say you have a pastor whose expertise is the scripture. Their expertise is philosophical understanding and ethical understanding and relationships between people. But then they think they also know just as much about geopolitics because they've listened to some podcast or watched some news. And so they're going to spout off on something that they might have an interest in, but don't have this background knowledge of. And you have these people that are going to question what a biomedical engineer says about a disease when they know nothing about it, but they just don't like the answers that they're getting. And so they're going to then say, well, here's the real answer. Here's what's going on in these different things or whatever. And so I think a lot of it just comes down to humility. This, to make a long discourse much shorter, just having the humility to be able to say, I don't know everything. There are people who are smarter than me on this particular topic. And if I do want to know anything, I'm going to have to go to those people and let myself learn under them. Let me sit at their feet for a while so that I can then know better. It's kind of like, I look at where I was as a pastor when I first started and where I am now. I'm much better having served under people who had done it for a long time and sat at their feet and learned what to do and what not to do than I was when I was 27 and thought that I knew everything and could just point out and say, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is why we have to do it my way. Where now I look at it and go, okay, there were some things that I was just completely ignorant about.
My guest today is Justin Woulard. Justin is a pastor, dad, techie, and dungeon master based in Pennsylvania. He also recently joined Virgils Inc. as Virgil number 7 after having been a customer, one of our first customers actually, in kind of the initial rollout of our fellowship program. So very thankful to have you as a colleague and a team member and as a podcast guest today. Justin, welcome.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, Christian, both on the podcast and being able to serve with you with Virgils. We've got some amazing things happening and I'm excited to come on and talk with you.
Thank you. Yeah, we have plenty of interesting things to talk about. I anticipate that this will be a very long form conversation. So first things first, a couple of current events. One extremely current event that I think would be good to go into. The first is breaking as of, I think, maybe 30 or 40 minutes ago. As you informed me, I actually didn't know about this until we hopped on. The Queen of England just passed.
One of the interesting things that we have with technology today is that we find out things when they happen. And I was thinking as I was getting that information that, she was 96 years old and she had served in this position for 70 years. And you think about it, it might have been a day or two before we found out that Queen Elizabeth had died if it had happened 96 years ago when she was born.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of wild to think about, actually. We're so used to getting that instantaneous information that if you do have some event of world importance, I mean, really back in the day, it could be weeks or months.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, you think about even when she first came in as the queen 70 years ago, you would have had to have been listening to the radio or picked up the newspaper the next day to find out what was going on with this. It would not have been instantaneous. It wouldn't have been one of those things that you just automatically knew. It's amazing to think about how much has changed in the culture, in technology, in the years since she became queen.
Yeah, she's seen a complete transformation and multiple cycles of it too.
Oh yeah.
It's not been sort of one straight arc. Like, I mean, so many things have changed. This particular topic of having instant access to globalized information reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend a couple of weeks ago at a sort of a couples dinner that he hosted, where he was talking about the difference in day-to-day thinking that people, like specifically medieval peasants, it's sort of like the 11th century or whatever, had versus now, was where they were focused was constrained in large part by the fact that they didn't know what was going on so far away.
Absolutely.
And even to to really illustrate that point, he was talking about how there were plenty of medieval Catholic peasants in Europe in that period who they didn't even know who the Pope was.
Right.
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 And now today with Twitter and, all these different channels, it's had this crazy, the pendulum swung so far the other way that all of these global events, especially in high fidelity and everything else, they feel really local. And that's a strange.
Think about
strange
when, Benedict became the Pope or Francis. We are watching on TV to see when the smoke is going to come and what color it's going to be so that we know what is going on and what is happening. But, again, it wouldn't have been that long to where you wouldn't have known till the next day you picked up the newspaper and found out. Or like you're talking about, you go back to those medieval peasants. They knew there was a Pope, but they had no idea who it was and probably wouldn't know for years that there had been any kind of changeover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's a question too of whether or not it's sort of a good thing to have unfettered access, because anything that you are paying attention to, attention is sort of constrained and non-fungible. It's going to come at the cost of something kind of locally. So what do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting question. And, I'm one who likes knowledge and likes information. So there's a part of me that just wants to take all that in. But there's two things there. Part of it is if you're taking in some information, that means there's some other information that is leaving. You might be taking in a lot of stuff, and maybe you're losing some important things for just knowing as much as you can. I'm one of those people that I'm great on a trivia team because I have lots of useless information in my head, but there are times when I don't have the important things. And when you think about it in this aspect, there's a part of me that wonders, why are we so obsessed as American citizens at times with the goings on of the British monarchy? And it's an important thing that a world leader passed, but at the same time, is it important that I know all of the drama that goes on with inside that family when I'm not even a part of that country and it doesn't have anything to do with me? And, and I'm part of a country that pulled away from that so that we didn't have to worry about it anymore. But so many of us are almost kind of addicted to that knowledge. It is interesting that we have all of this knowledge about the world at our fingertips. And I probably know more as someone who is somewhat disinterested about what is going on with the British monarchy than I know what is going on with the leadership in my township.
Why do you think that is?
I think some of it is the information is readily available about what is happening with the British monarchy, and even with the, even knowing what's going on in Parliament than it is knowing what's going on in my township council or my state legislature. We've lost, you said it kind of well, we've lost that local news because we've been so inundated with what is going on everywhere. So we don't, we have a newspaper here, Reading Eagle, and there is local news to be had, but it's not as easy to access as it is for me to get national news from CNN or the New York Times. I know more about what's going on in the West Village than I know what's going on in the township here because I have easier access to news from New York than I do from, 10 feet down the street. And so it's interesting when you start to think that way. And I think that part of that is, so many places have lost a daily newspaper. They might have a biweekly or a weekly or a monthly, but, they don't have that easy access to what is going on locally. And if you do, it's not coming to you as quickly and as abundantly as what you have coming from everywhere else. And so, you think about how that fits into the way that we live, how that fits into politics, how that fits into just what it means to be a neighbor in your neighborhood. We've gone from, in just probably 60 years, we've gone from everybody knowing their neighbor and knowing, what everybody in their neighborhood brings into that community, to living in a place where most of us are pulling into our driveway or pulling into our garage. The door is closed and we may not know the person that lives next door to us. But we know who the influencer is on Instagram, and we think we have a relationship with them because we're following them every day and hearing what's going on. And I think that's some of the same thing that we see in these big news cycles, where we feel like we've got some kind of intimate relationship with what is going on across the world, whereas we don't know what's happening right in our own backyard. And that makes a big difference because, we think about the changes that are going on around us. And if we don't know what's happening in our town councils, in our school boards, in all of these things that really do affect our everyday lives, but we're so focused on what is going on in other places, again, because it's readily available. Whereas, even 30 years ago, we would have known more about what's happening right here than we would have known everywhere else, because we had slower access to these things, and we would sit down with the newspaper on, in the morning while we're drinking coffee, or in the afternoon while we're waiting to have dinner, and we're sitting down and we're learning what's going on. And, I think about some of the people that I knew growing up that were reporters for the local paper, or, we're doing local politics and stuff. And I can think back to what I knew about what was happening in the city that I grew up in, and I have no clue what's going on in the township that I live in, or in the city that is right around us here most of the time. And so it's just an interesting thing to look at and say, I know more about geopolitics, which is great, but I know less about, just the local scene, because it's easy for me to get on Twitter. It's easy for me to get on, to get on CNN, to get on Fox News, wherever it is that you're getting your news, and find out what's going on outside. But if I even go in to search locally what's going on Twitter, mostly it's just going to be somebody whining about what somebody did down the street. It's just like another Nextdoor post. I mean, it's
right. There's not a lot of signal there.
No,
I think, as you're talking about this, it's just, I'm sort of seeing this picture in my head of how you're describing, like, downstream of information technology, there are just all these bizarre paradoxes.
Yep.
That in many ways can be a good thing. I mean, I think one thing to highlight, right, is although there is a lot of disinformation and unfortunately information can be weaponized and, post-truth era, whatever.
Right.
Like that's a real thing. At the same time, it causes information to escape, and it's a lot harder for power to conceal itself. So if you're able to have access to information about, a power structure, or, that perhaps it would be healthy to be a little bit skeptical of, that can be a good thing in terms of speaking truth to power, so to speak.
Oh, sure.
We've certainly seen a lot of movements with kind of mixed results that I think have emerged over the past 20 years or so as a consequence of this. But, on the other hand, even if you're able to get that information, you as an individual who actually is fixed in space-time somewhere and is not freely traversing space-time, right. As sort of like packets are on the internet, what you can control and do is inherently sort of local. So, there are those things locally that could just go completely neglected.
Absolutely. I mean, as a pastor, I've been talking about some of this recently on Sunday mornings, talking about, what does it mean to be a neighbor? What does it mean to live in the space that you're in? The way that I look at it is, God has put us in the place and in the time that we are for a reason. There is some reason why, he has you in Philadelphia at this time, or he has me here in Berks County at this time. And looking and seeing, part of it is finding out what that is. And I think on some level, it's a lot harder because we're living in this globalized space instead of in this community space. So we have to back up from that and be able to pull ourselves away from it and be very intentional in going and saying, I'm going to find out who my neighbor is. I'm going to find out who the people that live beside me and across the street from me and behind my house. I thought I was talking the other day in a sermon and I said, my dog has gotten out of my yard multiple times since we've lived here and into my neighbor's yard behind us. And I've gone into their yard probably 10 or 15 times. I have yet to have actually spoken to the people that live there. I could tell you nothing about them. And that's kind of difficult when you think about it as a community, is we don't know these people that are living around us. We pass by them in the night, and we're like ships passing in the night. That's all that we are at this point. But we are building these relationships in the metaverse, which is not a bad thing, but we have to look and say, we've got to build relationships in the real world, and we have to know what is happening right around us if we actually want to see change and make things better. And I think that's one of the things that we look at. Even I think part of the reason that some of these movements that you're talking about haven't worked is that they've been focused on fixing a huge problem from the global scale or the national scale. And the, what was it called a few years ago? See, I mean, that's the point, you kind of forget, but the Take Back Wall Street, the 1%.
Occupy Wall Street.
And here were some people that were talking about a huge issue and going to like the main place of it. But what would it been like if you looked and said, what do I do this? How do I do this in my neighborhood? How do I do this in my community? What does it look like in the small town that I live in or in the small city that I live in, to look and see what these issues are and to start to bring it about there? Because if you think about it, we have more influence in the community that we live in than we do on the national scale. Even if you think about it in a political sense, I've got more influence with my vote in my town council election than I do in the presidential election or a senatorial election or even a gubernatorial election, as you think through all of these things. And if we want to start to see change, it's going to have to happen in the communities that we live in. And that's one of the things that we have to look at. And so I look and think, it's great that I have all this information at my fingertips because I can learn about, what's going on in these places and maybe learn something I can bring back into my community as I look at another community that's doing something in a better way than what I see here. But I'm going to have to get out of the world of my phone and out of the world of my iPad and into the real world and actually begin to talk to people about what is happening so that I can find out what are the needs within my neighborhood? What are the needs within my community? One of the things that I learned as a pastor was anytime I've gone to a new place, one of the first things I try to do is look and see, where's my closest school? Where's the closest police precinct? Where's the closest fire department? And go and talk to those people and say, how can we serve you? What can we do to help you? Not saying, hey, this is what we're going to come and do, but really doing that research on the ground, talking to people and saying, going to the police chief and saying, look, we want to find a way to serve you guys. We want to find a way to help you guys. And that's something that we can do. Obviously, a church can do that. It's a group of people, but whatever group that you have could do that. If you've got, as you mentioned, I play Dungeons and Dragons, your Dungeons and Dragon group could get together and say, I'm going to go over to the local high school and say, we're just a few people that get together once a week and play Dungeons and Dragons, but there's like 8 of us and we'd love to see how we could help this school in some way. And you never know what that's going to be. Oh, we've got some kids who would love to play that. Could one of you guys start a club here? Absolutely. And so it's interesting to take those things that we're interested in, take those things that we love and see how can we bring those out in the community. But it's going to start with communication within the neighborhood, within the place where we live, instead of being so inundated with what's going on online.
I love everything that you just said. And one of my first responses and thinking about this as a listener is you're describing a set of activities that are very contrary to not just the way some of this technology has been designed and the business models that support certain digital media platforms, but I would say the culture itself that has evolved at least over the past, I think it's accelerated over the past 20 years, but I think it's been going on since maybe the 60s.
Yes.
One that's extremely self-oriented. And so even what you're saying, you use the term serve, right? The idea of primarily acting in service to another group, without any kind of expectation of reciprocation or transactional thinking or anything going into it, seems unfortunately probably kind of shocking to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that even within religious circles, and my perspective is mostly the church, but one of the things that we're taught is to serve. It is shocking to a lot of people within the church or within, these other groups where that's one of these things that we're taught to do. That's a core tenet of who we are supposed to be. And yet it is shocking because we have been so inundated with this culture of individualism and this culture of what can I get out of it? To the point where, you even think about, the buildup of some of these TV ministries and things that are all about what can I get? How, if you give me this is what I promise you God is going to give you. Well, that's selfishness, and that's not what we're about. And that's not what we should be about as human beings. And that's what, I look at when I even think back to even outside of the Christian ethic, just looking at the greats of philosophy, the best philosophy is all about how we come around together, and obviously we can find philosophers that are going to be just as selfish as the rest of everybody. But in the end, the best of it is always looking and seeing how do we create what's best, not only for me, but for my entire community. And that is what we are striving for. And honestly, I think a lot of times at the beginning, I think even some of these tech companies that we think of maybe have caused some of this expansion of this idea. You look back to what they were kind of supposed to be at the beginning, and it seemed like they were trying to build something out that was for building community, but it ended up being more about pulling it apart.
Yeah, that's been the consequence, I think, in some cases. And that brings up sort of an interesting point a previous guest had made, who's there's this really interesting project called Urbit, where they're trying to build this completely new networked computing paradigm that it's like a new internet, basically, is the way I would put it. And he had a pretty compelling argument or a case to make that a lot of the issues that we face, where the temptation is to point fingers at people or companies or anything else, are in fact a consequence of architecture, and perhaps not really. It's sort of very difficult to see prospectively, but now in retrospect, we see that there were some fundamental flaws, and really, how personal computing was designed. But I do think too there is that cultural component. These two things are somewhat sort of linked.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So on the local engagement piece, how I mean, maybe it's as easy as just going around and starting to talk to your neighbors, which just requires a little bit of discipline and
A lot of it.
I think it does require discipline and planning. It's a lot easier to get the feeling of engagement or the virtual experience of political engagement, let's say, by searching for something that's going to get you all fired up on Twitter.
Right.
That kind of shallow experience, because it's more proximal, but ultimately less satisfying, is going to prevent a lot of people from going out and meeting their neighbors, which that's
When I think
less
interesting there is, a lot of times we want to, wherever somebody is on the political spectrum, you want to make whoever's on the other side an enemy. And that's kind of what we've built up over like the last maybe 25, 30 years. It's kind of built, I would say, there's always been some of that. Like people want to say, oh, let's go back to the way things were. Well, I mean, Jefferson and Adams were really ugly to each other. I mean, we had, you can go back to the beginning and see some really terrible things that were done and said. But you think about, what's happened in the last 25, 30 years, really starting with the Clinton administration and moving on forward. And we've really pulled apart when it comes to politics. But what's interesting is, and you hit on this, but when we think about it, I was talking about, those ways that we just get into whatever's being said on Twitter, whatever's being said on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and it's just firing us up and we're like, yeah, get them. And, remember how you're going into that. But when you sit down and talk with somebody, it's amazing how often I will sit down and talk with somebody who ultimately, if I looked at what they were posting online, I would think that we fundamentally disagree on most things. But when you sit down and have a conversation and you begin to understand why they believe what they believe, why they may vote differently than you or support a candidate that you don't support, you start to find out not only do you have more in common, but you begin to understand why they support that candidate. And maybe those reasons aren't as nefarious as you thought that they were. And that's hard to understand sometimes because a lot of us these days, we've become tribal when it comes to politics. We hold on to that really, really strongly. And so we have to be willing at times to sit down and talk to that neighbor, sit down and talk to that friend, sit down and talk to that family member who disagrees with us and find where the common ground is and find out those things that we can work together on. What is it that we do agree on? What is it that we want to fight for together? And begin to look and say, yeah, man, I really disagree with you on this issue, but we do agree on this other. And we can come together and work together on those things. But it does take some intentionality. Like you said, if you're going to talk to your neighbor, you're going to have to be intentional about it. You're going to have to be thinking, okay, how do I do this? Well, I'm going to throw a barbecue in my backyard and I'm going to go so I live on a cul-de-sac. So I might look and say, I'm going to throw a barbecue and I'm going to go knock on everybody's door in the cul-de-sac and say, if you want to, we're going to watch the Eagles game and eat next Sunday. So come on and join us for that. Or actually this Sunday and then next is on Monday. But I've got the Eagles schedule in my mind. But, you're thinking through that, but you're going to have to be intentional about it. You're going to have to think, I want to build these relationships and I'm going to have to be the one that's going to start this. And I don't think it used to be such a difficult thing because everybody was expecting to, you think, I think you hit it right when you said the 60s, because I think if you go back to the 50s, we lived in what I would look at as a front porch culture where you were out on the front porch, you were talking to your neighbors, you knew what was going on. You were interested in what was happening with your neighbors' kids and all this, and they were all playing together and running around the neighborhood and all of these things. And we've moved from that, I think from the 60s on forward, to a backyard culture where we've built these privacy fences and we've built these decks. And instead of being out front where we're open with everybody, we've moved into a place culturally where we're blocking ourselves off from one another. and we're wary of what is happening in the house next door instead of looking and saying and inviting those people into our lives.
That makes a ton of sense. And funny resonance with when I said consequences downstream of architecture. I was talking about computer architecture, right, but you're literally describing the consequences of real world actual architecture. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, okay. Why should somebody care about building relationships with their neighbors when they can just get an unending stream of, engagement?
I think because those relationships are so much more real. And I think you can build relationships, real relationships online. I mean, I've got a group of guys that I play Dungeons and Dragons with every week. And we usually play on Sunday, but if several of us have some things, we'll move it. Like we ended up playing last night instead of Sunday. But I spend 4 hours a week with this group of people. And we have now for, come and go with some different folks we have for about 3.5, 4 years. We've gotten to know each other really, really well. But it is this, it's like what we're doing now. It's this video relationship. We'll play games. We'll sit and talk to each other. We're on Discord talking with each other. Those relationships are more real than the relationships I have with people I've never met on Twitter. But even those relationships aren't as real as the ones that I have with people that are coming into my home and sharing a meal and sitting down and having conversation. And the way I look at it is I have a very different relationship with the people in my church that I've sat down and had coffee with, that I've sat down and had a meal with, that have been in a small group with me where we've been studying scripture together, studying a book together, whatever it is, than I do with the people that just hear me on a Sunday morning that all I've ever said is hello to, because, we haven't reached out to each other and built a stronger relationship. And I look at that like the relationship with people on Twitter. There are people that I've met on Twitter, and now I have a stronger relationship with them. But there's people that, I've interacted with for years online, but all we've done is tweet at each other. I don't have a relationship. I don't have a real relationship with them, and I might learn from them. Like I've got some people that I would almost look at as like digital mentors in the sense that I've learned a whole lot from them and I've read what they've said and I've watched them, but they don't know me and I don't know them. And I think we've got this false equivalency of we think that we know people because we're interacting with them on Facebook or we're interacting with them on Twitter. But just think about what it would, how much stronger a relationship you can have with the person that you're standing in their yard and letting them borrow your lawnmower. Then, and you're having a real conversation about what's going on within your kid's school system or what's going on with, the new restaurant that's moved in down the street. These are things that actually affect our everyday lives. And most of the stuff that we're arguing about online doesn't do that. And so I think there are some great things about what we can do to build relationships online. I've walked with some of my friends online through some very difficult situations and kind of been a counselor in that. But those are relationships that are built more like those offline relationships and are very rare from what I see. But there's just something about having that in real life conversation with somebody. And it's like you and I were talking the other day and saying, we live about an hour away from each other. We actually need to sit down and have lunch because we've been talking a lot like this, but there's something about sitting down with somebody and spending time with them that actually will make this relationship better because we've actually met in person. And so I just think through all of these different things. And the other thing that comes down to it is I really can serve and I really can help the neighbor who is a block over from me or across the street. Whereas all I can do is sort of talk at the person who is following me on Twitter. And you can find some ways, and you can share helpful information, and you can do these kinds of things, but it's just not the same. I think strong relationships can be built online. I mean, part of the reason that I love what Virgils does is allowing children like my son to build strong relationships because they're meeting weekly with the same group of people, and they're meeting, face to face to an extent, even if it's in a virtual way. And that's a lot more real than the conversations that he's having with somebody on Discord or on Reddit or whatever. But it's still not quite the same as sitting down with a group of people and being able to interact with somebody, being able to say, oh, this, let's say you've got neighbors that need a babysitter this week, and you can say, oh, well, we don't have anything that we're doing Friday. We can watch your kids. And then they're saying, okay, well, the next time that you need a babysitter, we'll watch your kids. And you start to build this relationship. I remember my aunt and uncle, they lived in the DC suburbs in like the 80s and 90s. And I remember one time going up there, and they just had this circle of parents within their neighborhood that would share babysitting duties with each other. So they were never having to spend, whatever it was at that point, $7, $8, $10 an hour for a babysitter, because they were sharing with each other what they had, their time. And so I think that's really a lot of what it comes down to. Is it's really hard to serve and to share with other people when it's a completely virtual experience. Whereas when you build a relationship with people in the real world, you can do those things. You can actually take care of the people around you.
So, it sounds like these different digital media, which there's quite a variety. They maybe have their place, but ultimately it's not a substitute.
No. For
reality. And in fact, maybe best case scenario can act really as a stepping stone or some kind of, steps on the bridge back to reality. Like we like to say, if you find somebody who you maybe wouldn't have encountered in reality, and you can invite them to have a more intimate relationship by meeting up, that could be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And I can speak to that just in the sense of what it looked like for the church during the pandemic. We went for a while where we were fully virtual. And I was actually supposed to move up here in April of 2020. My first Sunday at the church that I serve in now was supposed to be Easter Sunday. And I had come up here in February to meet the people, and they voted me in, and all of these things that came along. And then I had several things that I was doing in the meantime, trying to, tie up some loose ends and do some things before I was coming up here. And then the pandemic hit. And the person who was the interim pastor here had already taken another position because he knew I was supposed to come up here. So there was essentially nobody here. So we started sharing the church services that we were doing in Louisiana with the church up here and sharing responsibilities. And I was trying to pastor a church that was 19 hours away. And you begin to look and see what it is to be virtual and what it is to be in reality. And I've talked to so many people, like we still stream our services every Sunday. We weren't doing that before the pandemic, and that can be an okay substitute when you can't come in, but it is not the same thing as a group of people actually gathering together to learn, to take care of one another, to worship together. And I think it's even more true with you coming from the Catholic tradition, because you literally can't do, unless the priest comes to your house, you can't do the Eucharist at home. And that's the center point of the Catholic Mass. Whereas the center point of, the Baptist service is the message. And you can kind of do that. It's not the same thing as being in the room. But how many people that I talked to that have said that, the virtual service is no substitute to the real thing, but it can be used to bring people into the real thing. We had several people during that time that actually started becoming a part of our fellowship in by joining us on Facebook or joining us on YouTube. And then when they felt comfortable coming in and gathering with a group of people again, came in and become integral parts of the community. But yeah, it's not the same thing. You cannot build the same kind of relationships that you can in the real world, but it can be an open door to that, to where you can start to find people that you have interest with. I mean, that's, one of the people that I met with this D&D group. I've invited him and his wife several times and said, look, you keep being interested in all this stuff that Jennifer and I are doing, my wife and I are doing in New York. And I said, well, you just need to come and spend a week with us and we'll take you up there. We'll go and do those things. And so there is this opportunity to build relationships from that. But I think that they can only be so deep if they stop in the virtual world.
Makes a ton of sense. I have a suspicion that there is a in some ways large, but also not immediately obvious error that I think people commit in thinking that the virtual experiences or the digital experiences are substitutes for the real experience, which makes sense. I mean, especially as digital media becomes more compelling, you've got virtual reality, you've got all kinds of crazy personalized experiences with AI and everything else. If you forget that the highest quality, experience that you're going to get is in reality,
right? And
it's very easy to get stuck in this imaginal world where accessibility is always going to sort of be superior versus the accessibility, sort of the options that you have in the real world. If that kind of makes sense, and so if you forget to come back to reality,
yep,
then something's going to start to feel like it's not, something's kind of off.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I think that's being felt in a lot of ways, across the US right now.
Well, and I think that's, and I think that people are starting to kind of wake up from that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think about, so yesterday was the big fall Apple announcement where, they said, here we've got 4 new iPhones and we've got 3 new Apple Watches and we've got this new iOS and that they had unveiled back in the spring, but it's going to be out this week. And here's everything that we've got for you. And it hasn't been that long to where I would have built my day around that Apple announcement. And I would have been at my computer or at the TV with the computer streaming it to the television, watching whatever Steve Jobs was giving me, or in more recent years, whatever it was that Tim Cook was showing me that day. And, I look at it now and I mean, there are a lot of reasons that come into it, but I knew it was happening, but I didn't think about it at all yesterday until I was, essentially, I look at it as reading the newspaper in the evening. I was going through my couple of news apps, looking at different things. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about the Apple announcement today. And I think some of that is the iterations aren't as big as they used to be. So there isn't anything as amazing being done as it was. So I think that's part of what it is. But I think some of it is exactly what you said, is I'm not living in that virtual space as much as I was. So I'm not worried as much about what that new thing can do as much as I was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I can do without it. Like it wasn't that long ago that I would be thinking right now, what do I need to do to trade in the iPhone that I have so I can make sure that I've got the new one without spending way too much money on buying it, flat out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that a lot of us are starting to kind of wake up from this digital utopia that we thought was going to come. And some of it is that it just hasn't. And some of it is that we're realizing what we've lost with so much focus on what's going on online.
Or that, I think that's right. I get a sense that people are waking up to that a bit. Although not everyone.
No.
Yeah, not everyone, but it's, ultimately it's, all the digital experiences, I think they're kind of asymptotic in that sense. I mean, like whatever virtual experience you're trying to give somebody, it might be more accessible, It's closer to you. It's going to give you a little taste of the thing that you think you want.
Yep.
But it's never quite as good as a real thing.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, it's like there's a guy named Russell Moore. You may have heard of him. He was a big guy with the SBC. Kind of walked away from it because of some attacks, because of some political views and stuff. But I won't go into there. But this was a guy that I really respected. I read a lot of his books. I followed him on Twitter and had heard him speak several times. And I happened to be coming back from a conference, and I stepped into a Barnes and Noble and had maybe somewhere between a 5 and 10 minute conversation with him. Just thanking him for his influence and talking to him about books. We both had stacks of books in our hands and, talking about what we were buying and reading and these kind of things. And I don't know, maybe a month, 6 weeks after I had that conversation, I got a handwritten note from him. This is a guy that was, had lots of stuff going on, but took the time to find out, to remember me, find out the name of the church that I served in, find that address, and write me a note thanking me for that conversation. And I still have that because that meant so much more to me than any time that I've been retweeted or some, influential person has commented on something that I've said, because there was this physical, not only the real world interaction, but this then continuation of that real world interaction of, he could have sent me an email. He could have sent me a DM, and that wouldn't have meant near as much as that 2-sentence note on a note card that was sent. And I've looked at that so often, and I had a friend of mine, and I've tried to do this several times and my ADD gets in the way, but I've got a friend of mine who every week writes somebody a handwritten note, letter, and mails it out. And I think that's such an amazing thing, because I've seen how much at times with different people that has meant to me, because there's just something different about having something that's real, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can smell, that is different than just an email. Because an email is, you might spend, that email might be 10 times longer, but it doesn't feel as intimate as that handwritten note that you've got, that hand typed note that you've got, whatever it is. And so there's just something about that connection that we have as people, that we need that real world interaction in order to, build out relationships. I even think, we'll probably talk way too much about my D&D group, but, these guys I play with every week, last year we decided to do a, Secret Santa thing. And we had before, with a different group of this same group, as people have come and gone, we had, one of these guys made everybody dice rolling trays at one point. And there's something just exchanging gifts and having real world things that we can put our hands on that were given to us by those people, that connects you in a much stronger way, because that person took some time to think about that, and they wrapped it up and they did this stuff and all of these things that come into that, and it's real. And I think that's virtual is great. There's a lot that we can get from it. Digital is great. There's a lot that we can get from it. You and I have been talking a lot about Midjourney. I think this AI art thing is fantastic, especially as somebody who cannot do visual art very well. But it's still not the same as the artwork that I have on my wall, that I can go and I can see the brushstrokes that somebody made. I can see the history of it. We've got 4 panels that I bought. I think it was for the second Christmas after Jennifer and I got married, and it is Jesus and Peter, and then we're not sure who the other 2 saints are. I usually say that it's Patrick, and I know it's Jesus and Mary, and I say the other 2 are Patrick and Peter. And those were hanging in our apartment and went through Katrina. And it completely changed those works of art. And I had put some pictures up of them online right after that happened and everything. And the artist actually said, if you want to bring them to my studio, I'll redo them. I'll fix them for you. But I looked at it and said, I don't want those to be fixed. These tell a grander story than they ever did because of what they went through and what that tells about us now. And those pictures of those that are online are still good. I took decent pictures of those, but it is not the same thing as standing in front of them and being able to see, where it used to be this thick paint there. And now it's just a patina of what once was. And you can see where, they were underwater and in the nasty water of the Pontchartrain and everything that goes into that. And just other works of art that we have that we've picked up at different times. I love these artworks that I have by unknown artists that will never be worth, tens of thousands of dollars more than any kind of print that I could put on the wall of the greatest artists who have ever lived, because there's some reality to it. It is more real. And so as beautiful as the things I can make Midjourney do and the things that I've seen you make Midjourney do, it's not the same as working with an artist and saying, here's the vision that I've got, and seeing them take that and turn it into something, bringing their vision into what you have brought up. It's cool. I think it's amazing. I think it will do some great things, but it's still not quite the same thing as having a real live person make that.
Yeah, perhaps it's meaningful because it is real.
Yeah, I think so.
That's sort of, what the three, sort of the Western traditions, the three things that we always kind of look to are the good, the beautiful, and the true.
Right.
And those just seem to be inherent characteristics of reality itself. So things that are good, beautiful, and true in the virtual world, they can approximate that, but it's always going to be, it's going to be imaginal. It's somehow still untethered from reality.
Right. I mean, I think you think of like the Platonic ideal, and that's never going to be the digital version of that thing.
Right.
It's just not. It's because it's not real. It doesn't have what you just mentioned there. I mean, it can approximate it. It can get really, really close, but it's not going to be. Now I want to put Platonic ideal into Midjourney and see what it comes up.
Midjourney and see what happens. Well, that's a whole interesting thing. I mean, this is maybe a topic for another time, but I've seen some kind of interesting commentary amongst the more philosophically minded about the connections one can make between the Platonic world of the forms and kind of cyberspace itself.
Yep.
And I think. Again, I think that's kind of an error to equate those two things. I think that it's something new. They have similar features, but it's not quite the same thing. No. So I just thought that was interesting. You brought that up. All right. So there are a few different threads that I want to pull on. The first is Dungeons and Dragons.
Sure.
We're definitely not done talking about D&D. All right. I'm gonna hit you with a very very big question, I guess.
Sure.
What have you learned about reality and human nature from playing Dungeons and Dragons?
Oh, that's such a good question. It is, oh gosh. Yeah, you're going to have to edit this because it's going to take me a minute to kind of think through it. I think it's coming down, and there is a sense in that I think you can find out real things about yourself in working through the role play in a fantasy situation. One of the things that I love about the campaign that we're doing now, our DM's really, really good. And we're playing in a campaign. It's very much changed from what the book is, but it's one of the official D&D books called Descend into Avernus, which is essentially going into the first level of the 9 hells to rescue a city that has been taken from the material plane down into hell. And so you're dealing with, devils and demons and all of these things, which automatically pulls you into having to deal with moral questions and having to deal with the gray areas in the world and how you work through. And my character in particular is, someone who has lived in this place that is the city that's been taken into Avernus, which is an idealistic utopian kind of everything has always been great and grand, and all of a sudden everything's flipped on its head. And if you think about we've all seen the memes of the Dungeons and Dragons alignments, and this guy is a guy who is lawful good. He has always followed the rules and is very much about that, but then gets put in a situation where I don't like either of these choices, but I have to make a choice. And there's been several opportunities with that. We were playing last night, and he's trying to protect this woman as they're trying to go through this city and get her and her children into safety. And he thinks he's got her in a safe situation. And then all of a sudden he doesn't. And this entity comes in and says, you have to either give yourself or give her. I'm taking her. And it's like, no, you're not. But then realizes all of a sudden, I can't fight this thing. I'm going to have to try to talk my way out of it. How do I, work through this? And am I willing to give up myself for this other person? And there's been several opportunities like that with different characters where you're looking, and that comes into then you're thinking about how in that moment, you're thinking about how would I react in, obviously I'm not going to be in a situation where I have a demonic entity telling me I'm going to take your soul or that other person's. But if I'm in a situation where I either have to be in danger or this other person is going to be in danger, what is it that I'm going to do in this? As you're thinking about, how to respond as this character that you're playing who is different than you, but there's no way that you're ever going to be, I think even as somebody who's written fiction, there's never going to be not a part of you in that. And so there is something that's going on there. So I think there is a sense of being able to learn about yourself in that. And I think that's where that conjunction of reality and virtuality or reality and fantasy come together. And I think it's also just there's something about a game like that is, it's like being on a baseball team or being on a football team where you begin to build relationships with those people as you are working together to reach a certain goal. And, especially with the group of people that, we've been telling this same story now for, a year and a half, and we're, spending 4 hours or so of our week together, going through this. You get to know the people both through how they play the character they're playing, but also as you talk about your life and you're building it out. And that's one of the things that I've really liked about tabletop games in general, because before I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, I got into, board games and all this other stuff that I hadn't been into for a long time, because there is something really cool. And again, as we've talked about, it's not the same online as it is, but it can approximate it. But being able to sit down across from somebody at a table and play a game with them, to me, is a lot more powerful than sitting down and say playing World of Warcraft. And yeah, I have my headset on and I can talk to that person, but I'm not seeing them, and I'm not, I'm not really spending time with them. It is, we're playing together, but not really. And I think it even made a big difference with our group when we went from just playing on voice chat on Discord to going to a video chat where we're actually seeing each other and interacting with each other in that way. I think there's something that is more real there than just the voice chat is.
And those lessons that you've learned about yourself and the other folks that you're playing with. Yeah. How do you bring those back into reality?
I mean, I think, it just comes down to, there are certain times where, I'll be in a situation and I'll equate it to something that I've done in that fantasy world where, and even as, at the times when I've been the DM, like in the group that I'm playing with some, in the, on the table, in the real world space, I'm the DM in that, and just thinking about, what I'm putting in front of people and how the people who aren't the center of the story are reacting to what's going on. Because the way I look at it is we're telling a story together, but the people who are the player characters in the game, they're the center of the story, and whoever I'm having them interact with are these, outside forces in this, and are really just dealing with how these player characters are reacting in this. And so I think it has come down to there being those times where, you begin to look and go, in this moment with what is going on, am I the center of this, or am I one of the people who is just a part of it? Because I think a lot of times we want to always be at the center, or at least, like I said, I was a theater major. I always want to be the center of attention. It's just the way things are. But, having to pull back from that and look and see, how am I going to react in this situation? I think on some level, it has allowed me to be able to be more thoughtful in, antagonistic situations, because I've had to be that way in, the D&D world, because not being smart and not thinking about what I'm going to do could mean the, dire consequences for myself or the people around me. I mean, you can have a character die because you do something dumb and you make the wrong person mad. And so in times where, I get into an antagonistic situation now, I might take a deep breath and I would have just moved forward, because in the end, I'm never in a situation that's life or death, but maybe I'm in a situation that might have real consequences. And so I'm going to think about it through it a little more. And I think too, it has been, as we were talking earlier, just a bridge into stronger relationships with people, because I can invite a neighbor over to sit down and say, hey, we're having a conversation and we find out that we're both interested in this. Hey, well, I've got a group of people. Why don't you come and join us one night and see if it fits together? And so it is a way to bring people together. And I think that's my favorite thing about it, is that it has been a way that I have either built or strengthened relationships with people that I probably wouldn't have otherwise.
How does this have any relationship with your pastoral work?
A little bit, just in the sense that I have, I played with people that have been a part of the churches that I've been in, and we were during Christmas last year. I was going through, I was preaching out of Revelation, and there was a section in there about a dragon, and I've got this big it's a big miniature dragon that I brought, and I was actually able to say, here's what I think this kind of looks like. And so, illustration wise, I've used some things, but I don't use it too much, partially in just the sense that there isn't a lot that has been particularly relevant, and because there is still some stigma within certain people in the church, going back to the 80s and the whole satanic panic and everything that goes along with that. And so, I don't in any way hide the fact that, it's something that I enjoy, but I don't bring it up a lot, just because you could be trying to teach something that you think is important and turn somebody off because you're using an illustration that is going to, bother them.
That makes sense. I guess I was thinking in terms of overall, skill set, like kind of working with the community.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely some of that. I mean, a lot of it for me has been a creative outlet, because, I haven't been on stage in a play or anything in a long time, but essentially I'm getting to play a character that I am writing and improvising, 4 hours a week. So I'm getting that creative outlet out there. And then even in just building a character and a backstory and those kind of things, it's that creative writing. It's thinking through all of these things. Honestly, I think through some of the campaigns that I've gone through with my friends, and you could turn these things into a novel. I mean, it is just because it's collaborative storytelling, and that's, to me, storytelling is just a huge thing. And this just happens to be right now my favorite form of doing that. And because I think that telling stories is ultimately the way that we best share information. I'm going to learn a lot better through telling stories and somebody telling me a story than anything else. Like, I can remember all kinds of things from history classes that I took, even back to like elementary. I remember the stories. I may not remember the dates. I may not remember every little detail, but I remember the stories that are able to then inform me in the way that I think and the way that I live and the way that I understand the world. I think it's true. And that may be one of the things that it definitely has affected in the way that I teach and things is I'm a better storyteller now through doing that, week in and week out than I was before I was doing that regularly, because I'm taking the time to do it. So I think it definitely has helped me in communication. And one of the things that I do at least once a year is I will read a book on some kind of communication outside of a, here's how to write a sermon book. So, I'll read a book on writing fiction or writing drama, or the most recent one that I was reading about a year ago. I just picked up this big fiction book because I haven't read a writing fiction book in a while. But I read a book on stand-up, how to build a stand-up routine and how to present it and everything. Because I think I learn a lot from how people are telling stories in similar ways to what I do, but different, and bring those into what I'm doing week in and week out of preaching a sermon. And so this is just one of the ways that I'm learning that, whether it is in doing it myself or spending time on YouTube or somewhere learning what other people do as dungeon masters and as players. And I think that has been, it's interesting when you think about the resurgence of role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons in particular in the last 5 or 6 years. And there's lots of things that feed into that. It is, we can talk about Stranger Things, and that put it back in the zeitgeist a little bit. They put out a new version of the rules that is less crunchy than it was before. But I think the big thing is been this online space that has shown people in the real world playing this game, shown people what it is. And people have looked and said, man, that would be fun to be a part of that. And they've built that out within their own realm, whether they've built it online or built it in the real world. But I think it has started with looking and seeing how much fun it is to sit around with a group of friends and play a game.
And you said this is something you rediscovered. So were you playing D&D when you were a kid? Or?
No. I kind of rediscovered it through like rediscovering board games where, and I didn't play them, but I didn't do it very often. As a kid, my mom and I would have Risk games going on the kitchen table for a week, and I can remember doing that and, playing things like Monopoly and Clue and these kind of things. And then, probably about 10 years ago, started getting into the more, the European board games, the more interesting, kind of more strategic kind of things that were out there. And that really started with wanting to build relationships with people in the college community that I was pastoring in at the time. And I started playing a game called Hero Clicks, and that led to playing a lot of these other board games. That led to me building up a collection so that I had things to play with people. And then that led to me starting to buy up some RPG material. Some of it was Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, and some other things. And I never really found the opportunity to play because I didn't know anybody that was playing those things at the time. And then finally did find an opportunity with a group that had been playing since like the late 70s. And they were playing this amalgam of different editions and all this stuff, but I had a good time, hanging out with those guys one night and doing that. And so then I started looking for more opportunities, which is where I fell in with the group online. And then when I moved to the next place after that, one of the other people that was on staff with me at the church played, and we started getting a group together and doing kind of things. But I think what I've loved about it is how it's built out creativity in other ways. So in building these relationships, me and my colleague started, building out wooden dice cases on his CNC machine and printing things out with a 3D printer and designing things and just having a great time. Like, when I play at home, I love like looking and going, okay, this is what we're doing today. I'm going to make a meal that fits with what goes on this. So there's so many different creative outlets that can go into this one particular thing. And I think that's what has drawn me to it, is as a person who is interested in lots of different things and who can easily become hyperfixated. There has been a bit of a hyperfixation on Dungeons and Dragons, but it has allowed me to reach out into all of these different realms and just scratch that creative itch in a lot of different ways and different places.
Very rich set of experiences, very multifaceted, multimedia, which I think speaks to you're talking about, so your own personality of, having a broad variety of different interests. And before we hit record, we were talking about this a little bit with even your education. So you mentioned you studied theater at one point and then switched. Was that right?
Yeah. So when I first I started off at the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, and went through, and so I started off as a journalism and a theater major, and I really planned on going into journalism because, at that time I was reading books on journalists and just fascinated with everything from written journalism to TV journalism. I actually took an internship at a television station locally there in Tuscaloosa for a while, and I love it. I still love that. Like, some of my favorite movies are about journalism. I could sit down and watch, broadcast news over and over again because I just love that world. But I got a little stifled when I went into my first journalism class, and they were essentially teaching us how to write and saying, if you're going to write as journalism, this is the way it's got to go. And they gave us that inverted pyramid method, and I can write that way. And I think it's a good way to begin, but there was a sense there, and now I know that it's not quite true, but there was a sense there that they were telling you, this is the only way that you can do this. And as a freshman, I was sitting there going, I don't want to do this. This is not what I want to spend my life doing, write these inverted pyramid articles. It doesn't fit me. And so I switched to being an English major. And so I was an English major and a theater major. And I loved being on stage, and I loved movies at the time. I still love movies. But, I had a collection of movies that rivaled Blockbuster in my dorm room. Like, people would come in, instead of going down to Blockbuster, they would come in and just knock on the door and say, can I dive through your movie collection and borrow something for the evening? And I mean, because anytime I had the opportunity, that's what I spent my money on that I made in high school were movies. And so, there was the thought of, acting, and I still love theater. And it's still a huge part of my life, not in doing it, but in enjoying it. One of the things I loved about moving up here is that I'm, 2.5 hours away from Times Square. So I can go to the theater, not still as often as I would like, but a lot more often than I did. And so, and there's great theater in Philly, and there's great local theater here. So I did that. And then I ended up graduating with a degree in English with an emphasis on creative writing with a minor in philosophy. Also took a lot of history classes. And so, and I look back, and if I had been less jumping around, I did. My problem in undergrad was I took classes I was interested in, not ever necessarily worrying about whether or not they fit on my degree path. So I took about 1.5 years longer than I should have in graduating, because finally I sat down and went, what do I have to actually take to get that piece of paper in my hand and finish this up? Because I had so many different classes and so many different disciplines. One of my favorite classes that I took was at the University of Alabama. They have what they called, I think it's still there, but they had what they called the New College, which was where professors could do whatever they wanted to. And so I took a class on Apocalypse Now that was like both a religion class and a literature class, and it was something else too. May have been a film class. I think it was a film class in the communications department. So it fit in all of these things. And so we read Heart of Darkness. We watched the movie. We watched the movie several times. We watched the documentary on making the movie. We listened to The Doors over and over and over again and studied all of this stuff. But it was this multidisciplinary understanding based on this particular film, and just then going into and looking at how does this film speak to philosophy? How does this film speak to theology? How does it speak to literature? What is going on here with all the influences that come into it? What makes this particular piece of art great? Mm-hmm. And there's something that's really cool about looking at things from these multidisciplinary understandings. And I even that was one of the things that I did. I did it in seminary again too. Took the things that interested me and tried to be a little bit more picky and make sure I was taking things that actually got me towards getting my master's degree. But I'm always just looking and saying, what's going to interest me? Where am I going to learn something that I can take in and put towards something else? Like one of the best books I read in the past year was an oral history on the making of the movie Dazed and Confused. And it was fascinating. And number one, it was, one of my favorite movies as a teenager. And then, but hearing these actors talk about what they did in making that movie, the people that behind the scenes and how they cast the movie, what it was like to be living in Austin during the time they were making it, in this time where Austin was even weirder than it is now. And all of these different things coming together that made an incredible piece of art. But then looking and saying, what is it about that allowed them to do that? And how do you look to recreate a scenario like that in order to build that out? And so I think we can learn a lot if we're willing to look at things from all of these different angles.
Yeah. And it somehow gets you perhaps closer to the truth, because if something, continues to be true, even if you're looking at these different angles,
right?
Then I'm sort of similar in that way, like generalist in some ways, almost to a fault. And that makes a lot of sense. There's one thing I don't want to let you let slip. I need to ask you about.
Yep.
You mentioned Apocalypse Now.
Yep.
What is the theology of Apocalypse Now?
It would be hard. Like I don't even remember exactly what all we talked about in that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was.
We can let it go.
Yeah.
But I was just like,
no, it is interesting. Like I'm trying to think of what we all got into, but when it was things about looking at Colonel Kurtz and how he understood himself and how he, because essentially as you get into that part of the movie, he's a god to those people that are around him. And so we were looking at, what is it like to be the outsider coming into what has essentially become a cult built around this man? But I don't exactly remember all we went into with it, but definitely looking into some of that hero's journey stuff. And essentially, when you think about it, that movie is the Odyssey. And, you see him, it is Heart of Darkness, but there's also this Odyssey as he's going down the river and reaching into these different pockets of things that are going on around the Vietnam War at that time. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in that, but I don't exactly remember where we got in, what the theological questions that he got us. I'd have to look and see if actually, I know I don't, because it died in Katrina. I don't have those notes anymore. Every once in a while, I'll realize, I could grab that and then go, oh, no, I can't. Because I used to keep any class that I had that was interesting. I kept my notes, but I don't have that anymore.
I would have loved to attend that class.
Oh, it was good.
That sounds
class,
amazing.
And I took a class, a summer class on the movies of Stanley Kubrick in the communications department that was also really, really good.
Oh, yeah. A lot we could talk about there.
Yeah.
Right. So you went to seminary, you became a pastor. One topic that, we sort of obviously like to talk about on this podcast is that of technology and how it intersects with these other things that are deeply important to us. So whether it's some guests that talk about mental health and take a more clinical perspective, others we talk about, the nature of work and et cetera, so innovation, all these kind of things. What is the role of technology in the 21st century in spiritual life?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot that it can do, and there's a lot that it can also get in the way of. And we mentioned it a little bit earlier when I kind of talked about how a lot of churches, including mine, went to a virtual model for a number of months due to the pandemic. And so all of a sudden, you're not only a pastor, but you're a television producer. You're having to learn how to use this technology and put all this together. And so on some level, it was a great thing. Number one, there was already the tech out there to do it and do it well and do it fairly easily. And then it also got in the way, as I think it slowed down people coming back, because there's an ease to being able to say, I could get up and go and gather with the people of my church, or I can watch church online and stay in my pajamas and stay in my bed and still feel like I got something out of it, but you're not going to get the same thing. So I think there's a place where we see the same technology have a good side and a bad side in it. I think some other things that you look at, and I'm a little bit of a Luddite when it comes to this particular thing, because I really like physical books. I have a Kindle and I'll use it some, and I'll read some things on my computer, but there's some fantastic software out there for doing biblical study and putting together sermons and Bible studies and stuff. The one that I use sometimes is called Logos, and it has, you can spend thousands of dollars on the software and all of the books and things that you can get to go into it. And it's fantastic when you're searching and want to, look, you've got we've got a library of thousands of books, and you can look up and see everywhere in any of those books where a certain passage or a certain topic is brought up. It's great. And I know people that every week, that's how they put things together. I've used it some. I'm not the best at it because I haven't really taken the time to really learn it, because there's something to me about sitting down with the books I know I'm going to use I would much rather be in a coffee shop than in my office and just sitting down there with my Bible open and my notebook and whatever I'm going to go and whatever else I'm going to be using. And then I'll take down physical notes, and then I'll put those, and then I'll make those digital as I'm kind of putting everything together. But I think that's fantastic that we have these resources out there. And I talk a lot about how, we have things on our phones now that make things a lot easier, both as, just individual people and as pastors. I've got a program that has has all the contact information and everything that we have on everybody who is a member of the church, that I can access that database from my phone if I need somebody's phone number, if I need somebody's email address. So if I get a text message that John Smith is in the hospital and I need to be able to check in, then I've got that at my fingertips. And if it's at 8:00 at night and nobody's at the office, I don't have to call the office and say, do you have so-and-so's phone number? I need to call them because there's nobody there. I don't have to wait till that next day. I've got access to it because it's all in the cloud. So there's some of these things that make the job a little bit easier. Honestly, texting does that, because I can look and say, as I get to know people, is this somebody that I should go and visit? Should I make a phone call? Or is this somebody who is going to best respond to me if I send them a text message? And especially being able to disseminate information out to a large group of people quickly. Let's say we've got a snowstorm and we're going to cancel services, and we didn't really know that until 7:00 this morning, and services, Bible study starts at 9 and services start at 10:30. I can go on, type a message, and automatically send it out to everybody that's on the list. Whereas before being able to do something like that, I would have had to have started calling people and told them, hey, you need to call your list. You need to call your list. You need to call your list, and call everybody and tell them that we're not having service this morning, which would have taken ultimately hours to be able to do that now I can do in seconds and get it out to everybody and know that they have that information. And so there's a lot of those practical things that come into it. And then I just think of the fact that, I don't have to carry around a big, heavy paper Bible with me everywhere. I have it in my pocket in whatever translation that I want it in. I can set up, there are apps that give you daily readings, daily devotional kind of things. There are apps that will give you daily prayer times if you are wanting to, say, follow a, particular method that's out there, the rule, a Franciscan rule where you're going to pray at a certain time of day, and all through this, you can set it up to where you're going to be reminded of all of those times. And I think these things are great. I think there's a lot out there. I think where things get in the way is, and I don't see it as much as I did maybe 10, 12 years ago. I think people have kind of seen that maybe it didn't work as well as it could. So one of the times when we were living on campus at the seminary, one of the jobs that I had was as a campus police officer. And I would spend time like sitting in the guard booth at the seminary it was just me and a computer. And I often worked these really late night shifts, and we would switch off Sundays. So we would rotate Sundays during the week. So on Sundays, if I was in the booth during the regular service time, I would look at one of these big churches that had a streaming service. And it was interesting that they looked at this as like an online campus at the time, and they would have chat going on the side, and they would have a certain pastor, a certain staff person who was in charge of that and talking to people. And they would look at those people as people who were attending their church. And I think we've gotten away from that a little bit because we've realized it's not the same thing. I think having things out there as podcasts, that's another great thing is, if you're looking for a church that you want to go to, you've got their website, and you've got often, whether it's on YouTube or a podcast form, you can listen to what's being taught there. You can get a little bit of a vibe of what is happening there before you ever step in the door. So I think the greatest thing that we have when it comes to communication and pastoral work or communication in the church just comes down, or technology in the church just comes down to communication. So, as you think about technology and being a pastor, as you think of technology in the church, what works really well is the communication aspects of this. And I really hadn't thought too much about that until I realized that everything I just said was all about communication.
Which is absolutely, essential. And I think you highlighted a lot of great use cases, where there are, pretty clear benefits. Whether it's, writing a better homily, or, if that's particularly helpful, or, being able to, I don't know if CRM is sort of the right term, but you have a database of the parishioners
it is essentially
responsible for. Yeah. Right. And so all those things are good. One thing we talked about before the episode was that there's sort of a downside or a risk that comes with any new medium. When it comes to technology and dissemination of information, which is, relevant. Back in the printing press was invented in the 14th century or 15th century, I think it was. And then the Reformation happens in the 16th century. And so, a very strong link there between the ability to print, print the documents, and then all of a sudden you have this disintermediating effect, which, on one hand, there are a lot of things that can be very positive about getting access to source material and whatnot. But at the same time, there's kind of the danger that when you're interpreting things for yourself without sort of trusted, some sort of safety net of wisdom that you can rely on, or an institution or something like that, you can introduce errors into your understanding of things.
And what's interesting is, you look at the printing press, and, so all of a sudden you've got the scriptures in your hands. because what happened was, I mean, you're moving from a situation where even what you did have was mostly written in Latin.
Mhm.
And so even if you could get your hands on it, you probably couldn't read it. And so when the printing press comes along, at first you're just getting more of that. And it's just easier for, you to have, a Bible in every parish where you got the material there. But then you start to have people beginning to translate the scriptures into their own language. And then you start getting it into people's hands and they begin to be able to read it for themselves. And, you think of the Reformation, you think of Luther, and Luther wasn't at first trying to, start a new break off of the church. He just saw some things that he thought were not going well and wanted to see them change. And essentially, because nobody wanted to change those things, we saw, what we saw. But it was because of people being able to sit down and begin to read it in their own language that you begin to see this doesn't really fit in with what I'm reading here. And I think we see a lot of that, even we can look at the church today. There's a lot of times where I'm reading things and going, this doesn't look like what we do. But I think what's interesting now is what you just said there about the wisdom and the knowledge. You see those same things coming because a lot of those guys that you see that beginning, they still had that background knowledge because a lot of them were priests. A lot of them had that understanding, those people that led that out. But now you look and like religious TikTok in particular is an interesting place to go because there is so much uninformed, just spouting out whatever they think in the moment about whether it's Christianity or other religions or these things, just because they're upset with how they understand what somebody is saying, even if they don't really get it at all, or they haven't taken the time and looked and said, yes, I did. Like we were talking earlier, I disagree with this person, but let me figure out why they believe what they believe so that I can talk about that instead of just going in and tearing people down. And so you see a lot of ill-informed or uninformed discourse when it comes to religious matters online, because we have this understanding. If there's anything bad that's come from social media, and there's a lot of things bad that have come from social media, but there's one that sticks out as we're talking about this, it is we all think that everybody wants to hear our opinion about everything. And, I even think about that in my setting, like during the latest presidential election, we had, you always have your presidential debates and your vice presidential debates and all these things. So partially it was just as me wanting to pay attention to what was going on. I decided I'm going to live tweet these debates. And what I did was I would just take random quotes of what was being said and match them with GIFs. So the first debate I did with West Wing GIFs, and then the vice presidential debate I did with Veep GIFs, and then the third presidential debate I did with Schitt's Creek GIFs. And so I did this going on just kind of, and it was more for me and inside jokes with friends of mine. But you have to realize that, even though like in no way do I have any huge, national platform or anything, I have a platform when it comes to the people within my church and somewhat within my community. And so there were some people that saw what I put up there, knowing that I was pastor of the church, and got upset because I was quoting certain things that were being said. And I was like, that wasn't my opinion. I just said what Joe Biden said, or I just said what Donald Trump said. And I ended up going in because I had somebody say, that there were some people that were upset about it. I ended up going in and deleting all of those, even though I thought that they were fairly witty. But we have to realize that people don't need to know everything that we think, everything that we say about everything. And that's one of those things that I think that in a role where your job is to serve people and take care of them, you have to watch what it is that you're putting out there on social media. I think that's one of the things that, technologically can trip us up. And I think this speaks outside of just the pastoral role. We have to understand this just in general, that something that we say that is completely innocent and is in some ways innocuous can be taken wrongly by other people because they don't understand where we're coming from with it. And, one of the ugliest things online right now, in my opinion, is the Christian side of Twitter. There are so many people, so many pastors, so many leaders that are just so ugly to each other because of their disagreements on what in the end are minor things often. But if our job is to share with others that we feel that you should live the way that Christ tells us to live, if we're not doing that in the most open face, front facing thing that we have in our life, how's anybody going to listen to us when, we're not being particularly neighborly online and we're saying, oh yeah, you need to love your neighbor. Well, that's not what it looked like yesterday when you said this to so-and-so. But
right.
So I think there's all of these things that can kind of trip us up in that too.
Yeah. Twitter is probably not the best medium to develop understanding around, very, very nuanced topics.
It's not a discipleship medium at all.
No. But on the other hand, there are digital media that can be useful. I mean, I think part of the reason, long form podcasts, I kind of have a suspicion that the reason why they've become very popular is because you actually can with a very long form conversation, you can actually get to some pretty good places of depth and extract insights that you can't get even if somebody's just sort of by themselves trying to write it out. In some sort of, philosophical treatise or something like that. So real discourse, maybe is possible. Twitter is probably not the way to do it. I think one of, you mentioned people have these maybe bold interpretations of scripture, let's say on religious TikTok. I do not use TikTok. That is kind of where I draw the line. So, so I'm not aware, but I have some.
My kids are on it. And that's my main thing. And it's funny.
Absolutely. I have some morbid curiosity maybe, so maybe I'll have to go check it out afterward. But there is now this really kind of disconcerting situation we found ourselves in where there's so much distrust of our existing institutions that are supposed to be those epistemic intermediaries who are able to package up information in a way that is both true and useful. And now it's, for a lot of bad reasons, but also some good reasons, people are extremely skeptical.
Oh yeah.
And levels of trust are very low. And I wonder, if you have any thoughts, both practically as an individual, but also maybe thinking about the future a little bit. What are some things that you can do as somebody who's having unfettered access to source documents, so to speak? How to make sense of it if it's not in your area of expertise, and then two, where does this all go?
And I think some of it comes back to what we were talking about earlier in trying to read broadly and be exposed to different things. Like I had someone a few months ago that had come into my office to bring me something. I wasn't there and just happened to kind of glance at some of the books that were on my shelf. And I had a book that they were sort of offended by. And, it was, kind of a religious, political kind of thing. And it was a couple of months before they brought it up to me. And once we talked about it, they understood. But I like to read all different sides of things. I've got to come from it and understand, as we've said before, understand what the other side is saying, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. And I had a very nuanced reason why I was reading this particular text, more about, dealing with my background and growing up in the South and these kind of different things. But as you're looking through this, you've got to open up yourself to be able to say, I don't know everything about everything. And I'm not going to understand this the way that somebody who's spent a lot of time in this area has looked at it. So even if I read their books and even if I've looked at it, I can't understand it quite the way they do. So I've got a friend of mine who is an Old Testament professor. We grew up together. We actually started recording a podcast together this week that we're going to start putting out in the next few weeks. And I thought it was interesting because you've got somebody that we're going to look at the same issues and look at them from a pastoral, understanding and a professorial understanding. I'm never going to understand the Old Testament the way that he understands it, because he has spent hours, hours, and hours diving very particularly into those texts and very particularly in understanding the ancient Hebrew language. Do I have a somewhat grasp of that language? Yeah, a little bit. Have I spent a good bit of time studying those books? Yeah, especially if I'm going to be preaching through one of those books. But I have not spent as much time as he has. So I know, I mean, oftentimes if I'm going to preach on an Old Testament book, I'll send him a text message or an email and say, what commentaries do I need to pick up in order to understand this book better as I go into it? And so I think at some point it's understanding there are people out there who know more than I do about these particular things, about these particular topics and what is going on. And so, you're just looking in and diving into those things, because I think that's part of what I see online is we all have gotten to the point where we think that we're experts about everything. And, part of the problem that we see with a lot of the online discourse is, you have people who, let's say you have a pastor whose expertise is the scripture. Their expertise is philosophical understanding and ethical understanding and relationships between people. But then they think they also know just as much about geopolitics because they've listened to some podcast or watched some news. And so they're going to spout off on something that they might have an interest in, but don't have this background knowledge of. And you have these people that are going to question what a biomedical engineer says about a disease when they know nothing about it, but they just don't like the answers that they're getting. And so they're going to then say, well, here's the real answer. Here's what's going on in these different things or whatever. And so I think a lot of it just comes down to humility. This is, to make a long discourse much shorter, just having the humility to be able to say, I don't know everything. There are people who are smarter than me on this particular topic. And if I do want to know anything, I'm going to have to go to those people and let myself learn under them. Let me sit at their feet for a while so that I can then know better. It's kind of like, I look at where I was as a pastor when I first started and where I am now. I'm much better having served under people who had done it for a long time and sat at their feet and learned what to do and what not to do than I was when I was 27 and thought that I knew everything and could just point out and say, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is why we have to do it my way. Where now I look at it and go, okay, there were some things that I was just completely ignorant about because I could look and say, here's the way I would do it, but didn't take into account of the people that I'm supposed to be coming around and serving don't necessarily want to do it that way. And even if I think it's the right way to do it, I'm going to have to bring them around in a slower way and show them why I think this is the way to do it instead of just saying, okay, this is the way we're doing it. We're changing everything tomorrow. And I think, we have to be willing to just say, I'm going to learn from other people because I don't know everything. And there's a part of the online discourse on Twitter, on YouTube, on TikTok, on wherever you go, that is full of people who think that they know everything about everything.
And it's very hard to discern if you're a passive consumer of that, what are you going to, what kind of signals could you even pay attention to? I guess how many followers somebody has, maybe they're more credible. The reputation problem is a serious issue.
And I think sometimes we take it down to like whoever has the best production values. Because we're like, well, if they had the time and the money to put this together, they might be good. But I have seen some really good productions on YouTube that are full of, garbage.
Just errors.
Yeah. Whether it's history or, theology or whatever it is, just people that just don't seem to quite know what they think they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why, one of the things that I recommend everybody do actually, if you want to start developing a healthier relationship with technology in the digital world, is to Put your phone on black and white because color is very easy. You can use that to manipulate people. And then 2 is, I think, one of the most underrated Apple features. There's something in Safari called enable reader mode by default.
Oh yeah.
And reader mode, what it does is it turns every web page into the same look and feel.
Yeah.
It's just text, images, same font, typeface, everything else, and eliminates all that production value and the charisma. Obviously videos, it's different, but at least for web pages, it kind of levels things out so you can focus on the content.
And I loved it when you showed me that. And another benefit of reader mode is it will also often get you around paywalls.
That is true.
Oh man, I shouldn't have said that because now they're going to figure it out.
Now they're going to know.
When it comes to institutions and knowledge is, you think about things like, for a long time, the New York Times has been the paper of record. That's kind of where you go to look for journalism and to understand what is going on. If I'm looking for a historical event, it's a place to go and find out what was being said about it. But we've gotten to a point where, as you were saying, institutions are so mistrusted that what is still, and maybe it makes me a liberal, but what still is, in my opinion, solid journalism, and usually, most of the time, if it is in the journalism section, it's news and not opinion, is now looked at as being biased and quote unquote fake news because people, don't want to trust what is out there. And, they'll trust somebody's mom and pop website, whatever they put up instead of the people who have trained to learn how to find the information and put it out in a way that we can understand it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most insidious types of self-deception that somebody can find themselves having waded into on the internet is where you do find a mom and pop shop where they're saying exactly the thing that you had a hunch about.
Yep.
If you do have kind of some degree of distrust in the institutional, I don't want to use narrative because it's not like it's made up or something, but whatever, whatever the official story is. And this is where you get into the conspiracy theory world. And that is just, there's such a dark thing there because you think that you've deceived yourself into thinking that you're pursuing the truth, where it's actually just this kind of self-oriented reflection that makes you feel smart or something like that, right? And that's a big danger. I think people go down really, really bad paths sort of through that process. The thing that came to mind actually, I thought of was, you said having humility is good and important. I think it was Saint Bernard who was asked. I think it was Bernard of Clairvaux who was asked, "What are the 3 most important virtues? The 3 greatest virtues?" And he replied, "Humilitas, humilitas, humilitas."
Mm-hmm. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, because if you look at and I got a hard out at 5, so I don't have time to get into a theological discourse really. But, when you think about it and you look at, sin from a biblical perspective and start to look and see, what is it that, and I think you can even look at it from a secular perspective and kind of come up with this same idea, but ultimately it's a worship of self that is what is driving so much of what we do that is sinful in the world, that is, bringing negative things into the world. It's pride. It is putting myself up and saying, well, I am God and therefore everything revolves around me. And so what is going on and what happens to the people around me really doesn't matter because it's all about me anyway. And to me, that's, part of the reason that I'm a Christian, that I'm a pastor, is that I see that Christian ethos fights against that better than anything else that I see in the world. And so it really, it comes down to, humble yourself. And I think that's true, whether we're quoting Paul or we're just looking at somebody who doesn't care what the scripture says and just wants to live a better life. Humble yourself, put other people before yourself. And what it comes down to, and I've said this so many times that it's almost, it is cliche to a point, but, if I'm putting other people before myself and all of them are putting other people before themselves, we're all going to meet our needs because everybody's going to be meeting one another's needs. And that's the, and I think that there is a sense where, and you and I talked about this, I think yesterday, there's a sense where I think that in the utopian ideal of the internet that was there in the earliest beginnings of it, there was that sense of that's what we're here to do. We're here to take care of one another and give everyone access to all the information because that is going to make the world a better place. But we forgot the fact that people are going to get on here and lie just as much as they're going to get on and share the truth with one another. And they're going to get on to try to build themselves up as much as they're going to get on to try to share with other people.
Yes. And human beings on some deep level are good, but also just like incredibly susceptible to deception, self-deception. I mean, that is to be human in many ways.
Yes.
So I of course, and I think you and I both are extremely hopeful. I think that there are both technological as well as cultural and educational paths to a better world in the 21st century. And we can learn from, I think, some of the mistakes that have been made, especially over the last 20 years. I want to bring it down to sort of a more personal lens.
Yeah.
You were a Virgils customer.
Yeah.
We had the pleasure of serving your family through the fellowship program, and then also doing some guidance with you and your wonderful spouse. What have you learned from that process?
I think the biggest thing is, that this is another realm where building some kind of community is what is going to help work through these technological issues. And, so I look at, the reason that we came to you guys, we got some information from the schools about an opportunity. If you've got a kid that is having, some issues with, video games and screen time and these kind of things. And my middle child, my son, was having some issues with that. And we had been trying to work through it, and we had tried some different things and said, well, I'm willing to try anything that's out there. If this is a good opportunity, let's look into it. And so we came into it, and, I've seen him have a better attitude towards electronics, towards technology, towards the games than he did before he was in there. And I think a lot of it was having this community of other kids who he was able to talk openly with and hear their stories and be able to tell his and go in and say, yeah, I mean, this is why I am drawn to this. And you and I had a lot of conversation about that, even with me wanting to work through my own technological, issues with spending too much time on my phone and these kind of things, where it was something that I had been working on my own for a while, but having somebody to sit down and talk to about it and look at the underlying whys of it, instead of just looking and saying, I know I spend too much time on Twitter. I know I spend too much time on, used to be for me, it was all my, blog feeds, my RSS feeds and all this kind of stuff, being able to look and say, here's why I'm doing this. You and I talked a little bit about this particular game I'd started playing, and I looked on my screen time and realized, I've been spending an hour a day on this ridiculously, I didn't really get a whole lot out of it. It was just something to do, but I realized that what it was, I've got this collector's mentality. I collected baseball cards as a kid, and there's other things that have come in. I mean, even with the Dungeons and Dragons thing, it's like I've picked up probably more stuff that I need because I've kind of got this collector's kind of thing of wanting to have these different things. And so being able to look at that and see how that was driving my desire to be playing this game helped me to be able to understand what I was getting out of it, what I wasn't getting out of it. And I deleted it off my phone and hasn't been back on there because I understood it a little bit better. And so I think that it is just, being able to dive in and look and see what's underneath it which as a parent has helped me on my own end and also helped my kids, because before it was just, me saying, you can do this for an hour. You can do this for 2 hours. You're going to turn it off after that. And it becomes a battle. Whereas now we can talk about and go, why is it that you're spending so much time here? What is it that's drawing you into this? And so I think a lot of it is that the experience of going through the Virgils program has opened up dialogue to where before it was just a monologue from me talking about why you don't need to do it and why, you need to find some time to do some other things. And I think what it taught him was looking and seeing what I'm getting out of this and how do I translate that into some of the things that I'm interested in outside of the screen, and trying to put some time and energy into those things.
Really glad to hear that. I mean, it sounds like some of the fundamental kind of techniques and some of the ideas, these are things, as we like to say, it's like, it's simple, but it's hard. Eat right, exercise, like don't, like people know what they need to do, right? It's like, don't bring your phone in your room, but having that relational component, sort of something communal in the case of your son, but then we obviously were able to have a lot of dialogue to try to understand, what was at the root of whatever was going on with technology use was.
I think it's one of those things too, again, talking about what I said earlier, understanding that there are people that have studied this and spent a little more time with it than you have. And I mean, you knew a lot of tips and tricks on the iPhone and I thought I knew a lot about. And then you were able to show me some things that I didn't know that have very much helped me. And so building out these relationships where you're working with somebody, like I know for me in particular, I always work better with a team than I do by myself. One of my mentors, he sent me the letter that he sent to a group that was looking at me at one point as pastor. And he sent me his recommendation. And on that, it said, like after he had sent it to them, he sent it to me. And on that, it said, Justin always has a lot of good ideas. He thinks outside of the box, but he needs a team around him to tell him what ideas are good and which ones are just plain crazy. And I was like, oh yeah, that's absolutely true. And here's a person that has gotten to know me well enough to see that. And so I think, again, this is kind of one of those things where you're building those relationships, you're building that community out to where you have somebody to go to when, you're struggling with, I'm getting too much into this particular thing. I need somebody who's going to hold me accountable. And so I think that's been a lot of it for him is it's helped me to be able to hold him accountable in a more healthy way, but also having these friends that he's interacting with. And he's starting in the Inner Circle program tonight. And so I think that's going to be another good thing where, he's building out these relationships in a more long-term basis that's going to be good for him.
I'm really, really glad that we've had this opportunity to have you join us.
Yeah.
I'll say too, just personally, I was always a pleasure working with you and Jennifer. I think one of the challenges for us going forward as a company is there are definitely some best practices which are kind of emerging from the conversations that we're having. Every week it was like, let's experiment with something and see how it goes. And at the same time, it is, these are personal computing devices. Everyone has a very bespoke, very deeply personal relationship. And so that does require pretty significant degree of self-reflection, which can be helpful if you have a partner. And that's, that's always very personalized.
And I think it's self-reflection and it's trust. It comes down to like some of the things that you and I worked out, like I've done them in a slightly different way but I trusted you and said, well, I'm going to keep it this way for a couple of weeks and see what works for me and what doesn't. And, one of the things that we did, we took all the apps off of my screen, and I realized that I needed to go back and put the 4 apps at the bottom, partially because aesthetically it was bothering me that there was that space there that wasn't being used. And then partially because I knew the things that I have to get to very often, and it's better to have it readily available than having to go and kind of search for it. But so there's a difference between me and you where I learned something from you, trusted, here's a guy that knows what he's talking about, and then looked and then changed it a little bit to fit me a little bit better. So I think that's part of the understanding that we have with, the people that we're working with, as you and I are working with parents, is we understand, hey, we've got some ideas, we've got some best practices, but the way they end up implementing it might look a little bit different than the way that I've implemented it. And that is a good thing.
That's correct. And I think if things go right, it not only will look different like it should, because it is a deeply personal process of self-reflection, and exactly the kind of relationship you're going to have with your devices is contingent upon what your goals, what the path you're supposed to be on are. And that's true for your family and everything else as well. So, I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm curious, is your phone still on black and white?
It is.
How's that been?
It's been good, and I like I think I told you, I got it set to where I can double tap the back of it, and it'll do color or change the back and white. And 9 times out of 10, if I turn it color so that I can do something like Canva or something, I'm turning it right back to black and white. Sometimes I'll end up realizing, like for a day I didn't do it, but I'm keeping it on black and white. I think it is, part of it is I do like the aesthetic of it. And then part of it is that I've noticed that it does, like, I don't sit there and scroll Twitter like I would when it's that way. And that's my big vice, is spending way too much time on Twitter.
Totally get that. I know you got to go in a second. Yep. I'm curious too, is your computer on black and white?
It is not. I had it on that way for a while, but I'm doing too much that I need the color for that. It was more distracting because I was having to change it all the time. So I took it off of black and white, but I do still have the black background and nothing else on it, because that was very helpful. That helped me with my ADD distraction issues.
Yeah. Just get rid of the clutter. Yeah. But black and white might be a bridge too far. I don't think anybody I've worked with has actually kept the computer on black and white. I'm a little bit crazy, but I have found it to be good. The one thing that's been interesting around that is I do notice that especially during lunch or something, I'm just like drawn to go outside. More. Yeah. Like, where am I going to get color? Exactly. Where am I going to get vibrancy?
Exactly.
Reality. Yep. So I don't know. Awesome. Well, I know you got to get going. I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation, the first of many. I think there are a lot of really interesting topics we could talk about, especially as you and I both learn, as part of the Virgils Inc. family.
Absolutely.
As we continue to grow the company and everything else. I think all these topics are only going to be increasingly of practical importance, top of mind for folks, especially families with kids. So before I let you go, I want to make sure that I get a chance to share ways to connect with you. So you're on Twitter and Instagram, is that right?
Yeah, I'm on pretty much everything, and but Twitter and Instagram is what I use the most. But if you want to find me on Twitter or Instagram, just look at Justin Woulard. That's going to be, but that's the same on Reddit. It's the same on Facebook. You search me, you'll find me. There's not a whole lot of people with my name.
Perfect. And one last plug. So you started a podcast called The Pastor and the Professor, and this is with your friend who's the Old Testament expert?
With my friend Jonathan Patterson. He's a Old Testament professor at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and we're going to talk about theological issues, we're going to talk about church issues, but we're also just going to talk about cultural issues. And essentially we're taking one topic a week and diving deep into that, and then otherwise looking at what is in the top 10 list or the top selling list on Amazon for different topics, and talking about what we think about that. That's, we're having some fun. And it'll be out there for everybody to see on whatever podcast platform they're using in 2 or 3 weeks.
Perfect. Spotify, Apple Podcasts.
Yep.
Whatever floats your boat. And the first episode is out.
We've recorded it, but
you recorded it.
Okay. We want to get 3 or 4 in the bag before we start putting it out there, because I've learned if you don't get a little ahead of yourself, you're going to get sick and get COVID like I have right now, and not be able to stay on your weekly schedule.
Yeah. No, that's tough. Cool. Well, everybody go check that out. Justin, it was a pleasure.
Good talking with you, Christian. I'll see you soon. Have a great one.
All right. Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.